So a couple of months ago, I swapped over to the M3 MacBook Pro, and I really liked that machine. I had no real need for such performance. I mean, we have videographers who would arguably make better use of it, but that doesn't mean I can't enjoy it, right? Well, unfortunately, the overlords above called my boss ultimately decided that no mere mortal should have that much power. And so I was forced to let it go. But it wasn't all that bad, because while I gave up some CPU performance, I gained a full extra inch in screen size. This is our review of the 15-inch M3 MacBook Air. Okay, so it's not often a review starts by stating that I'm actually downgrading from one product to another, but I just want to first add that prior to that MacBook Pro that I had for a couple of months, I was actually daily driving the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air, and apart from the times that I was reviewing other laptops, for over a year I probably used that smaller and more iconic 13-inch MacBook Air, so most of what I will be saying for the 15-inch MacBook Air here will be in comparison to its smaller sibling. And I gotta say, I'm loving the bigger display. There are certainly some trade-offs that you make going from a 13 or 14-inch laptop to the 15-inch class, and I'll get to those in a minute. But I just want to say that this is a really gorgeous display on the larger MacBook Air. So here's the key features on the 15-inch MacBook Air's display. We're looking at a 15.3-inch liquid retina display, pushing a 2880 by 1864 resolution with a max resolution of 500 nits. And as expected with a modern MacBook, even though it's technically just an IPS panel, it gets bright enough that even though I've had my fair share of OLED laptops over the years, the MacBook Air's display here still holds up just as well. And unless you've been exclusively staring at OLED screens for like 5 years or so, you won't really notice that, oh, the blacks are a tiny bit not as black as the OLED one. But perhaps the best part really about moving to a larger display is that watching content on it is simply sublime. You really do get a better sense of immersion with whatever you're watching, especially if it's an atmospheric scene or a movie. It gets even better in fact thanks to that 6-speaker sound system with force-cancelling woofers, a fairly noticeable upgrade compared to the regular 4-speaker sound system on the 13-inch MacBook Air.
The Smart Hashtag 3 is essentially the sporty coupe version of the Smart Hashtag 1. It shares the same motors and battery configuration, but this EV is sleeker and offers slightly more range.
Personally, I quite love the display, and the only real thing I wish it had was a higher refresh rate. Adding Pro Motion to this could have honestly made it just phenomenal for work, especially if you're swiping around constantly between multiple spaces on Mac. But as is always the case with Apple, even on their iPhones, only the Pro tier products get Pro Motion. One other nice to have though is that the M3 MacBook Airs now support up to 2 external displays. As long as the laptop lid is closed, that is. It's a nice addition to have though, especially if you use the same laptop for both on the go and docked at home in a desktop setup. As for what you lose going from a 13-inch MacBook Air to the 15-incher, honestly, not much. I mean, it's only a 2mm sticker anyway, so you're not really gonna notice anything there. It's definitely longer, of course, gaining almost 4 cm in body length, and it's like what, 300 grams heavier? I mean, it's still lighter than the 14-inch MacBook Pro, so it's not really a huge trade-off to make, especially if you want a large screen MacBook without wanting to fork out for a 16-inch MacBook Pro. Also, if you don't like washing your hands, then congratulations. The 15-inch MacBook Air in Midnight now has the same kind of breakthrough anodization seal to help reduce the fingerprints on the chassis, similar to the recent MacBook Pros with the M3 family of chips. And as always, you can expect great build quality with practically no deck flex and a very sturdy lid to go along with it. Moving on to the performance, the new MacBook Air of course comes with the Apple M3 chip, which is an 8-core CPU split between 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores with a 10-core GPU and the 16-core neural engine. If you're gonna be honest, no one buys a MacBook Air for raw performance, but we did some numbers on it anyway, which you can see here. in reality, if you were already on one of Apple's more recent MacBook Airs, chances are you won't really notice a huge jump in performance. And I don't mean that as a slight against M3, not at all. But rather, it's more of a compliment to how good Apple Silicon has been over the years. If you're on an M2 MacBook Air, for instance, it's practically no difference in day-to-day workloads. I was able to get on with my job just fine with the usual 20 to 50 Chrome tabs and like multiple Photoshop projects. Plenty of stuff in the background too, like Spotify and Discord. If you were coming from the MacBook Pro, on the other hand, like I just did, then yeah, it'll feel a little bit less responsive, not helped by the fact that this is a 60Hz display, of course. Now, there's one game that I play quite a lot on Mac, and that would be Football Manager 2024. And having played it on all three of the MacBooks that I've used in the past couple of years, the performance is, unsurprisingly, much better on the MacBook Pro thanks to its active cooling. On the 15-inch M3 MacBook Air, gaming performance will suffer a little bit the longer the session goes, though it definitely took longer for frame drops to actually happen compared to the M2 MacBook Air that I had before this. That being said, I have noticed that under load, the 15-inch M3 MacBook Air just gets a little bit hotter than the M2 did, though it's all mostly kept to this region underneath here. Again though, I want to reiterate that you're not buying this for performance or gaming. In fact, there's a good chance you're buying this for its battery life, which again is absolutely top tier. You know how sometimes people say that once you see a magic trick, the next time you see it again, it's just not as amazing? Not in this case. Just like the M2 Air and the M3 Pro that I've used before this, the M3 MacBook Air sips power in day-to-day use. And I was able to comfortably go through an entire day at work no problem without ever reaching for the charger if I started the day at full battery. Now, it wasn't all plain sailing with the 15-inch MacBook Air. I still definitely miss having more I/O available to me. And if you're in the creative industry, you'll certainly appreciate the full-size SD card reader in the MacBook Pro. And of course, if your preferred operating system of choice happens to be Windows or some esoteric flavor of Linux, then you wouldn't really be bothered with the Mac in the first place. But for those who do want to use a MacBook, you know, maybe you're already on an iPhone or you're upgrading from an older Intel-based MacBook Air, then the new M3 MacBook Air looks like it could be quite a decent option, right? I mean, especially against the oh so expensive MacBook Pro. Well, the only problem is that the 15-inch MacBook Air is also kinda expensive. In fact, the 15-inch MacBook Air starts off at 6,199 ringgit for the base option with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. The one we have here with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage on the other hand is 7,799 ringgit. Remember how we said the MacBook Pro was supposed to be the expensive one? That actually means that this very same laptop here costs more than what the base model 14-inch MacBook Pro with M3 costs. And if you want to match the 16 gigs of RAM, that makes the M3 MacBook Pro just 500 ringgit more than this top-of-the-line 15-inch MacBook Air. Now, what does that 500 ringgit extra get you then? Well, you lose a little bit in screen size, sure, by going down to a 14.2-inch display, but that's a Liquid Retina XDR display that's not only a higher resolution, but much brighter too. And has ProMotion 120Hz adaptive refresh rate as well. You'll also find slightly better speakers, a longer rated battery life, significantly better I/O with HDMI and SD card slot, and while it's the same Apple M3 chip under the hood, there's active cooling too for better sustained loads. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad laptop, far from it in fact. This is yet another brilliantly built laptop from Apple. The only issue then is its pricing, because while it starts at over grand less than the 14-inch MacBook Pro starting price, once you add in some upgrades to RAM and storage, you end up with a laptop that's just way too expensive to justify anymore, especially when you can get the same chip in the M3 MacBook Pro. The 13-inch MacBook Air, of course, starts much cheaper, and you can even get it with M2 for less money. But the 15-inch M3 MacBook Air is just stuck in this weird position of being a great laptop with a not so great price. And yeah, that's it from me on the new 15-inch MacBook Air. Let us know what you think of Apple's MacBook lineup down below, and if you yourself are willing to shell out for the larger MacBook Air that we have here, or if you prefer to stick with the smaller 13-inch MacBook Air instead. This has been Raymond, signing out.